I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. Just me, my old pickup, and the ranch. No deadlines, no alarms, no HOA rules breathing down my neck. I drove down the long dirt driveway, feeling the tires crunch over gravel and the scent of dry earth and pine hitting me like a welcome mat. There's something about being on your own land, your own little slice of freedom, that makes you forget all the chaos of the outside world. I pulled up in front of my barn, the one that had seen more storms than I care to count, and swung the truck door open. My dogs bolted out like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment, tails wagging so fast they were practically helicopter blades. I leaned back, letting the sun hit my face, and took a deep breath. Finally, peace, or so I thought. From the edge of the neighboring subdivision, yes, that perfect little HOA fantasy land where lawns were obsessively trimmed and paint colors were dictated by a rulebook thicker than the Constitution, someone was starring. She was unmistakable. Blonde, perfectly coiffed, wearing that pink blouse that screamed, "I am here to enforce rules you didn't even know existed." I immediately knew HOA Karen had spotted me, and I knew trouble was coming. I didn't panic. I've dealt with a few Karen types in my life, but this one had a kind of energy you couldn't ignore, like a storm cloud hovering just over the horizon, and I could feel the tension in the air start to thrum. She was marching toward me, phone in hand, ready to explode into some kind of official declaration about how I had broken some imaginary rule that didn't even exist on my property. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my arms over my head, and my dogs came bounding back to me. "Easy, boys," I muttered. "Don't scare the lady with the dress code for dirt." I couldn't help the chuckle that escaped. Sometimes, humor is the only way to deal with this type of crazy. Karen stopped at the edge of the property line, squinting at me with that all-too-familiar expression of moral outrage. Arms crossed, chin up, ready to lecture, I waved politely. "Morning, Karen, beautiful day, isn't it?" She didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her phone, and I could see the frantic way her fingers flew over the screen. My heart sank a little. This wasn't going to be a normal neighborly disagreement. Oh no, this was going straight to the authorities. She was dialing 911. I laughed under my breath, though it was more nervous than anything else. I mean, seriously, 911 over a pickup truck parked on my own land? This was like calling the fire department because someone baked cookies without a permit, but I wasn't about to run. I planted myself firmly, leaning against the truck, letting the morning sun warm my back. Sometimes, the best response is to do absolutely nothing and let the crazy talk itself out. I watched her pace a little, muttering to herself like she was reading from a manual only she could understand. Community standards, violation, rules, enforcement. I raised an eyebrow. I guess they just hand these things out like candy, I muttered to myself. And then I noticed the neighbors peeking out from behind their perfectly trimmed hedges. The ones who had learned long ago that HOA Karen's energy was unpredictable. Some whispered to each other, some just shook their heads. I gave them a small wave. "Don't worry, folks," I said under my breath. "This should be entertaining." As I settled into a chair on the porch, sipping the coffee I'd brewed that morning, I realized the calm I'd envisioned was already slipping away. The trucks of distant deputies were on the horizon in my imagination. I didn't know if they were actually coming yet, but Karen was dialing with the kind of focus reserved for life-or-death emergencies. Every click of her phone made my stomach tighten a little. I tried to shake off the feeling and turned my attention to the dogs, who were now playing chase around the barn. I could still hear Karen muttering in the background, waving papers that probably didn't even mean anything. "She's serious," I whispered to myself, still amused, but aware this was escalating faster than I anticipated. And then, just as I took a sip of coffee, I felt the first real spike of tension. Karen had pressed the call button. That small, innocent-looking gesture, it was the signal that my peaceful weekend had officially entered the danger zone. I looked at my truck, then at the open land stretching beyond the fence. This was my property, my ranch, and yet the universe, or at least one very determined HOA Karen, was about to test exactly how much trouble one person could stir up over a simple parking spot. I exhaled slowly and leaned back. "All right, Karen," I muttered, "let's see how far this goes." And with that, the weekend that I thought would be all peace, cows, and coffee had officially turned into a showdown. One where I had a legal right, a sense of humor, and apparently an entire storm of overzealous HOA fury heading my way. I had barely finished my coffee when I noticed Karen marching toward me, her heels crunching on the gravel like a warning siren. She wasn't just walking, she was on a mission. The kind of mission that involves righteous fury, unchecked authority, and apparently an obsession with your truck. She stopped a few feet away, glaring like she'd just discovered a crime scene. I raised a hand, trying to keep the peace. "Morning again, Karen. Lovely day for rules enforcement, huh?" Her eyes narrowed. That's when I realized sarcasm might not work here. She waved a stack of papers at me, the kind of stack that makes you think, wow, she probably sleeps with these under her pillow. "I'm calling this in," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "You're violating community standards. You have no right to park here." I blinked and then I laughed, not a polite chuckle but a full-on, slightly hysterical laugh. "Community standards?" I asked. "Karen, I own this land, every inch of it, and unless community standards include common sense, which apparently they don't, you're going to need to try harder than that." Her jaw dropped. I swear, for a second I thought she might combust from sheer disbelief. But instead, she did what any modern HOA warrior does. She pulled out her phone, probably preparing a full dossier for the 911 operator, complete with a PowerPoint presentation and pie charts. I watched, half amused, half curious, as she fumbled with her phone. Her fingers flew over the screen like she was typing out the declaration of war. And in that moment, I realized the absurdity of the entire situation. I was about to be reported to the authorities for parking on my own property. I tried to keep calm, leaning against the truck with my arms crossed. "You know," I said casually, "most people call 911 for emergencies, fires, accidents, that sort of thing. But if reporting a legally parked truck counts as an emergency now, I guess the world has changed since I last checked." Karen didn't laugh. She couldn't. She was too busy muttering about regulations, property lines, and what would the neighbors think. The neighbors, oh, the neighbors. I noticed a few peeking out from behind their hedges, faces a mix of horror and suppressed laughter. I waved at them. "Don't worry," I muttered. "The show's just getting started." I turned back to Karen, who was now packing, phone to her ear, muttering something that sounded like, "Yes, I'm reporting a trespass. No, not the one on the street, the one on MY lawn. Well, not really mine, but close enough." The dogs, sensing the tension, started circling her, tongues lolling but ears perked. I raised a hand to them. "Easy, boys, she's dramatic, not dangerous, I think." Karen's packing became more frantic. One minute she was gesturing wildly, the next she was pointing at the truck like it had personally insulted her. She muttered about fines, penalties, and rules that apparently covered the parking of vehicles on property she didn't own. At this point, I wasn't even sure she remembered what she was upset about. She was just angry. I tried to step in a little more seriously this time. "Karen, let's be honest here. You don't have jurisdiction over me or my ranch. This is my property, my land, and the 911 operator isn't going to issue a citation for parking in a driveway you don't own." She froze, one hand still in midair like she was about to snap a finger and magically make the laws bend to her will. Then she shook her head and muttered, "Well, we'll see about that." And that's when I knew things were about to escalate. You could see it in the way she held the phone, knuckles white, muttering every HOA rule she could remember like a mantra. She was about to drag the law into a parking dispute on private land. And from the look on her face, she expected the sheriff to show up and instantly declare her the winner. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. My weekend of peace was about to become a showdown, and I had no idea how far Karen was willing to go. I glanced at the horizon, imagining a squad car pulling up, flashing lights, the whole cinematic entrance. The suspense tightened in my chest. And just as I took a sip of coffee, the phone on Karen's hand clicked. The 911 operator had picked up. I froze. That small, ordinary sound was the signal that this wasn't just a neighborly argument anymore. This was official. And I was about to find out just how far a determined HOA Karen could push before reality, and the law stepped in. I leaned back against the truck, dogs circling at my feet, and muttered under my breath, "Well, Karen, let's see what happens next." I didn't have to wait long for the next act to begin. Karen's voice carried across my property like a foghorn, urgent, dramatic, and entirely unnecessary. "Yes, there's a suspicious vehicle, trespassing, illegal activity, it's on the property line," she shouted into her phone as though every word could summon a SWAT team instantly. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, trying to make sense of it. A suspicious vehicle, illegal activity. I glanced at my own truck and shrugged. It had a few scratches, some mud on the tires, and smelled faintly of old leather and peanut butter. But illegal, that was a stretch. The dogs, oblivious to the chaos, chased each other around the barn, tails wagging, ears flopping. One of them barked at Karen. I shot him a look. "Not now, buddy. Let the crazy human do her thing." Through the speaker of her phone, I could faintly hear the 911 operator, calm and professional. Karen was practically vibrating with indignation. "Yes, I need not the fire department, I need the sheriff. This person is trespassing on MY property. They're in MY driveway." At this point, I had to suppress laughter. "Her driveway," I muttered. "Pretty sure it's mine, but okay, Karen, sure, let's see how this plays out." The operator's calm voice contrasted beautifully with Karen's frantic rambling. "Ma'am, can you confirm the address?" Karen's eyes widened as if that question was a personal attack. "Yes, well, technically it's 432 Ranch Road, but also adjacent to my subdivision, so you have to understand." I leaned against the railing, silently counting down the seconds until someone in uniform would arrive. My mind wandered briefly to all the HOA horror stories I'd read online, thinking this is it, my moment of entertainment for the weekend. And then it hit me, she actually believed she was going to get the law on her side for a parking violation on land she didn't own. The audacity, the confidence, the pure, unfiltered delusion, it was almost impressive. Almost. I decided to narrate my thoughts out loud, partly for my own sanity and partly because the scene was absurd enough to deserve commentary. "Imagine calling the cops because someone parked where they literally have the right to park," I said to the empty air, and then trying to explain property law using HOA rulebooks that don't even apply. I'm on the edge of genius-level confusion here. Karen's muttering continued. She was reading sections of her HOA manual verbatim, pointing at random lines and waving her arms like a conductor in an orchestra of nonsense. "Yes, Section 12, Paragraph 4 violation, they must vacate immediately." I sipped my coffee, trying not to snort. This was getting good, or bad depending on your perspective. My weekend was officially hijacked by someone who believed she had authority over reality itself. Then the operator finally said something that made my stomach flip. "A deputy is on the way, please stay calm until they arrive." I froze, the suspense tightened in my chest like a rope pulling me upward. The dogs noticed my tension and stopped their game, tilting their heads at me as if asking, "Is this part of the fun?" I glanced at Karen. She looked triumphant, as if she had just launched the final missile in some kind of HOA war. I couldn't help the sarcastic thought that flashed through my mind. "Congratulations, Karen, you just called the cavalry to a parking dispute." Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The quiet hum of nature around the ranch contrasted sharply with the ticking of tension in my chest. Every rustle in the trees, every distant bird call sounded like the approaching sound of a siren. And then in the distance, a black and white patrol car appeared, bouncing slightly over the gravel of the country road. My heart raced, not with fear but with anticipation. The sheriff was arriving, and Karen's little saga was about to meet the real world. I straightened up, setting my coffee down. The dogs perked up again, sniffing the air. Karen took a dramatic step forward, phone still clutched to her ear, ready to declare victory before anyone could say lawsuit. I exhaled slowly and muttered to myself, trying to maintain calm. "All right, Karen, let's see what happens when someone who actually understands property law shows up." The suspense was unbearable. The sheriff's car grew closer, crunching over the graveled driveway. I could almost see the calm, authoritative figure stepping out, clipboard in hand, ready to diffuse or escalate the situation. And as Karen waved her phone and her rulebook like a torch of righteousness, I realized one thing. My peaceful weekend at the ranch had officially become a showdown. A showdown between someone who knew the law and someone who thought HOA rules could bend reality itself. And I had front row seats. I hadn't even finished my coffee when the crunch of tires over gravel grew louder, sharper, a rhythm that made my heart skip with anticipation. I straightened up, trying to act casual, though inside, I was buzzing with the kind of excitement usually reserved for a movie climax. The black and white patrol car came to a stop in front of the barn. The sheriff stepped out with a calm, deliberate pace, eyes scanning the scene. His boots crunched over the gravel as if he owned every inch of this quiet ranch, though I knew better, this was mine. My dogs, sensing someone authoritative, slowed their playful circle and sat down obediently, tilting their heads. Karen didn't notice anything except her own reflection of righteousness. She practically lunged forward, waving her papers. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here. This man," she pointed at me, though her finger trembled a bit, "is trespassing. On my property, I demand you." The sheriff raised a hand, calm, firm, unmovable. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, carrying authority without raising volume, "I need you to step back and let me speak with the property owner." Karen's jaw dropped. "The what?" she stammered. I tried to keep a straight face. "Yes, Karen, someone who actually understands reality has arrived," I thought, leaning against my truck. My dogs nudged my legs, apparently agreeing. I stepped forward. "Morning, Sheriff, this is my ranch, my property, my driveway. She's concerned about parking." Karen sputtered. "It's illegal, She waved her HOA manual like a shield. "Section 12, Paragraph 4, I have the authority to." The sheriff calmly interrupted. Ma'am, I've reviewed the property records. This is private land owned entirely by this gentleman. You do not have jurisdiction here. HOA rules do not grant enforcement powers over private property outside your association's boundaries. Karen froze, blinking. She muttered something about community standards, like repeating it might magically make it true. But I'm protecting the neighborhood. I swallowed a laugh. Karen, the neighborhood is behind the fence. I'm here on my land. You're standing on a public road at this point, waving your rule book like it's a sword. The sheriff didn't flinch at any of it. He looked at Karen like she was a curious puzzle, the kind you stare at for a while, trying to figure out how someone could be so confident yet so completely wrong. Ma'am, you need to understand your authority ends at your property line. This man is within his rights and your threats are unwarranted. Karen's hands flew to her head. You can't do that, the HOA. Your HOA has nothing to do with this property, the sheriff said. Simple, clear, like a teacher correcting a stubborn student. I could see the panic starting to set in behind her perfect blonde hair. Her whole persona, built on the illusion of control, was beginning to crumble. I kept my voice calm, narrating silently to myself, watch her face. This is going to be a classic meltdown. She tried to argue further, gesturing wildly at my truck, at my barn, at the wide-open expanse of land that stretched as far as the eye could see. This is against the rules. The sheriff stepped closer to Karen, politely but firmly, and said, Ma'am, if you do not respect the property lines and cease your harassment, I will have to ask you to leave. This is a warning. Karen's eyes widened, the color draining from her face. Her phone slipped from her hand, almost as if gravity itself was conspiring against her. The neighbors peeking from behind hedges began whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. I caught one of them giving me a thumbs up. I smiled inwardly. This was it. The moment when the law met HOA fury and only one side could win. Karen's fury had been relentless, but now reality was stepping in like a cold splash of water, shocking her into comprehension. I let the sheriff handle the rest, leaning against my truck, arms crossed. My dogs sat obediently at my feet, occasionally glancing up at Karen like they too were judging her, and honestly I couldn't blame them. Karen, still muttering about community standards and fairness, finally took a tentative step back. Her hands shook as she grabbed her papers and phone, glancing nervously between me and the sheriff. The tension in the air was palpable. I knew she was realizing slowly, painfully, that her little crusade might be ending, just not on her terms. I took a slow breath, letting the suspense hang in the air. The showdown wasn't over yet, Karen still hadn't left, but the balance had shifted. The sheriff had arrived and he had made it crystal clear. Laws mattered more than HOA delusions. And in that moment, I knew. The weekend I thought would be peaceful had officially transformed into a legal chess match, with Karen already realizing she was one move away from defeat. I thought that with the sheriff standing there, calm and authoritative, Karen might finally realize that her reign of HOA terror had limits. I was wrong. So very, very wrong. Her eyes narrowed and she planted her feet like she was about to start a siege. You can't just dismiss the rules, she shrieked, waving her HOA manual in the air as if it were a holy relic. Community standards must be enforced. This truck, this person must comply. I had to resist laughing outright. The sheriff remained patient, calmly explaining that HOA rules didn't apply on private property outside the subdivision. Karen's response? A dramatic gasp and a huff that sounded like a steam engine running out of control. Fine, I muttered under my breath. Let's see what happens when she escalates. And escalate she did. She began packing in front of the sheriff, pointing at my truck, my dogs, my barn, and even the empty space behind me as if invisible violations were lurking everywhere. This isn't just about the driveway, she shouted. It's the visual disturbance, the precedent. If this goes unchecked, the entire neighborhood. I raised a hand, cutting her off. Karen, I own this land, my property, my rules. You're standing in a public area now, yelling at me like a lunatic, and it's officially harassment. Her jaw dropped like someone had told her the sky was actually purple. Harassment. Yes, harassment, I said, and the sheriff agrees. Karen whipped around to glare at him, apparently expecting a sympathetic nod or some kind of reinforcement. Instead, the sheriff just gave her a flat, unwavering look, the kind that makes even the boldest people reconsider their life choices. Ma'am, if you continue to interfere or refuse to leave, I will have to take further action, he said. Karen froze like she had never encountered someone in a uniform who wasn't immediately impressed by her theatrics. She muttered something about due process and fair treatment, but it came out more like a wheeze than an argument. I took a step forward, leaning slightly on my truck. Karen, I'll make this easy for you. You can leave now or we can make it official. Her face contorted in indignation. Official, how dare you? I am protecting the community. I chuckled under my breath. The community that doesn't own this property? Sure, Karen, that's exactly what you're doing. She paused, then suddenly pivoted, trying a different tactic. If you don't move your vehicle, I will. She trailed off, flailing her hands. I couldn't tell if she was about to invoke some mystical HOA law or declare martial law on my driveway. The sheriff stepped closer, speaking calmly but firmly. Ma'am, I've explained the law. Your authority ends at your property line. You are interfering with a private citizen's rights. If you do not leave, I will issue a trespass warning. Her eyes went wide, and for a brief second I thought she might actually consider leaving. But then, because of course, pride and delusion got the better of her. She threw her hands up and shouted, "You can't do this. You can't just ignore the rules." The tension was palpable. The neighbors had now fully gathered at the edges of their fences, whispering and pointing, some recording on their phones. It felt like watching a slow-motion comedy of errors mixed with suspense, the kind of story that makes you question how anyone could survive being so wrong yet so confident. I leaned back against the truck, letting the sheriff handle the situation. My dogs settled by my feet, watching Karen with curious eyes, like they were assessing whether she might actually pose a threat or just entertainment. The suspense kept building. Would Karen finally back down, or would this escalate into something that required actual legal action? Every dramatic flare of her hand, every shrill declaration made it clearer that she was teetering on the edge. I could see it in her posture, the frantic packing, the shallow breathing, the sheer panic behind the meticulously styled hair. And then with a final dramatic flail, she froze mid-gesture, phone dangling from her hand. Her eyes met the sheriff, and in that moment I knew the tide was turning. Reality had arrived, and Karen was about to discover that her HOA theatrics only go so far when confronted with someone who knows their property rights, and a sheriff who isn't buying the drama. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the tension. The weekend I thought would be peaceful had turned into a full-blown showdown, a legal and psychological duel between an overzealous HOA enforcer and a man who owned more land than she could ever comprehend. And as Karen glared, muttering about fairness and precedent, I realized the next move was going to be decisive. The question was who would blink first. I could see Karen's frustration reaching a boiling point, her face a perfect mix of disbelief and indignation. She had spent years building her little kingdom of rules, and now all of it was crumbling before her eyes. I took a slow sip of my coffee, silently narrating the scene for my own amusement. This is better than reality TV, I thought. The sheriff stepped closer to her, calm but commanding. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady, cutting through her frantic chatter, let me make this very clear. This property belongs to him. You do not have authority here. HOA rules do not extend beyond your subdivision boundaries. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish, muttering something about fairness, justice, and precedent. The sheriff didn't even flinch. He repeated, slightly slower this time, you are interfering with a private citizen's rights. If you continue, I will have no choice but to issue a trespass warning. I couldn't help but smirk. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone who believed they could enforce imaginary rules suddenly confronted with reality. My dogs, apparently sensing the drama, sat at my feet, ears perked, watching Karen with what I can only describe as judgmental curiosity. Karen, of course, didn't leave. Instead, she tried a new tactic, pleading, Sheriff, you don't understand. I'm protecting the neighborhood. If this goes unpunished, everyone will follow his example. I raised an eyebrow. Yes, Karen, the world will collapse because you saw a truck on private land. That makes perfect sense. I fought the urge to laugh out loud. The sheriff remained patient, but I could see a subtle firmness in his posture now. He wasn't just explaining, he was asserting authority. Ma'am, your concerns are noted, however your actions are harassment. You are standing on public property, interfering with private property rights, and refusing to leave. You must depart now, or I will have to issue a formal trespass warning. Karen's eyes widened. She probably wasn't expecting actual consequences. Her fingers twitched, holding the phone like a lifeline. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, struggling to comprehend that not everyone bends to her drama. She opened her mouth to argue and then paused, a slight tremor in her hand betraying her growing panic. But the HOA, she began. The HOA has no jurisdiction here, the sheriff interrupted, voice calm but sharp. Property ownership and the law take precedence over your rules. You are being warned. Leave now or face trespass enforcement. I felt the tension in the air thicken. Every second Karen stayed, the suspense ratcheted higher. Would she storm off in defeat, or would she push it further, risking legal consequences she clearly didn't understand? The neighbors, who had been peeking over fences, now leaned forward, some recording, some whispering in disbelief. I leaned against my truck, trying to appear relaxed while secretly feeling a thrill. There's something intoxicating about seeing someone so utterly convinced of their own authority finally confronted with the reality they ignored for so long. I whispered to myself, "This is it, the moment the narrative flips." Karen, still clutching her phone and muttering about fairness, finally took a small step back. She glanced at the sheriff, then at me, and I could see the panic starting to edge her confidence. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to droop a little under the weight of her humiliation. The sheriff, sensing her hesitation, gave a final, firm statement. "Ma'am, I am giving you one last opportunity to leave the property. You have no legal authority here, and your continued interference is considered harassment. Depart now." Karen's hands flew to her face, and she muttered something about justice and the community that made no coherent sense. The suspense reached its peak. She was standing there, caught between ego and reality, and the law had firmly planted its foot on the ground. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension hang in the air for a moment, savoring it. My weekend, which I thought would be quiet and uneventful, had turned into a showdown of wills, rules, and common sense versus delusion. The sheriff had made the position clear, the warning had been delivered, and Karen was teetering on the edge of losing control completely. And I just knew that the next move was going to be decisive. Either Karen would leave and I'd finally have my ranch back in peace, or she'd push too far and the law would step in fully. The suspense was unbearable even for me, and I had the front row seat. One misstep from Karen and the entire narrative was about to flip, dramatically, publicly, and, if I'm honest, satisfyingly. I could see it in her eyes. Karen's confidence, once as solid as a marble countertop, was crumbling. The sheriff had laid it all out clearly, my land, my rules, and her authority non-existent. But like any self-proclaimed enforcer of imaginary laws, she wasn't going down quietly. She muttered something about community standards and precedent under her breath, pecking back and forth as if sheer willpower could bend reality to her side. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, savoring the tension. Oh, this is going to be good, I thought. My dogs, sensing the escalation, sat at attention, ears perked, as though even they could sense the climax approaching. The sheriff cleared his throat, calm but with a hint of finality. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. You have no authority here. Your continued presence is harassment. You are officially being trespassed from this property. You need to leave immediately." Karen froze like she had been shot with a stun gun. "Trespassed?" Her voice cracked as if the words were physically painful. She spun around, waving her HOA manual like a white flag of defiance. "You can't do that. I'm protecting the neighborhood, I am." "The neighborhood isn't your property," the sheriff interrupted, firm, unyielding, music to my ears. "You are being asked to leave. This is a legal order. Trespass warnings are not suggestions." Her mouth hung open, and for a moment she looked like a deer caught in the headlights. I felt a strange mix of amusement and disbelief. She actually thought that her little HOA handbook could override the law. Karen's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, probably imagining she could call anyone to save her honor. The neighbors, now fully gathered behind their fences, whispered among themselves, some even filming on their phones. I could hear snippets of conversation. "She's actually getting told off," and "Wow, the sheriff just shut her down." I stepped forward slightly just to enjoy the show. "Karen," I said, calm but with a grin I couldn't hide, "you might want to start taking notes. This is a lesson in reality." Her eyes darted between me and the sheriff, desperation building. But the HOA," she began, voice trembling. "The HOA rules do not apply to private property," the sheriff repeated, clearly trying to speak slowly enough for her to understand. "You are trespassing. Leave now or I will enforce this order." And then, in a mix of rage and disbelief, Karen did something I could barely process. She stomped her foot, threw her papers into the air, and tried one last desperate appeal to morality. You're ruining the neighborhood. Everyone will think that people can just." The sheriff raised a hand. One calm, decisive gesture. Karen froze mid-sentence. I swear I could see the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was out of power, out of options, and out of control. Finally defeated, she looked around at the gathered neighbors, at the sheriff, at me, at reality itself, and began the slow, dramatic retreat. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she walked backward, muttering incoherently about rules, fairness, and justice, trying to save face while failing spectacularly. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension release like a balloon deflating. My dogs wagged their tails, clearly sensing the victory. The sheriff gave me a nod, acknowledging that the situation was now under control. I smiled, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief at how absurdly satisfying it all had been. As Karen disappeared over the edge of the property line, I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. She actually got trespassed for trying to enforce HOA rules on MY land. The universe has a funny way of setting things right. I glanced around at the neighbors, some of whom were still whispering and laughing quietly behind their fences. I gave a small wave. "Enjoy the show," I muttered under my breath. It's not every day you see someone learn the hard way that HOA rules have limits. The sheriff walked over, giving me a few pointers about what to do if she tried to come back or continue harassing me. I nodded, mentally filing it all away. It was a good weekend after all, just not the quiet, peaceful one I had imagined. And as I finally settled back into my chair, sipping the now slightly cold coffee, I couldn't help but reflect. Sometimes the law doesn't just protect you. Sometimes it delivers justice in the most satisfying, dramatic way possible. Karen had made one fatal error. She underestimated the combination of property rights and law enforcement, and in doing so, she had written herself a story she would never forget. After Karen finally stomped off the property, muttering about rules and prejudice in a voice only she could understand, I sank into my porch chair and exhaled. My dogs circled happily, clearly celebrating the victory in their own way. One of them even jumped onto my lap like he wanted me to share the glory. I laughed, scratching behind his ears. "Yep, buddy, we survived HOA Karen. The ranch is ours again." The sheriff lingered for a few minutes, making sure Karen didn't double back or escalate further. He gave me a nod, the kind of nod that says, "You did nothing wrong, and yes, it's as ridiculous as it sounds. Everything under control now. If she returns, just give us a call. We'll handle it legally." I nodded, smiling. "Thanks, Sheriff. I think I've learned more about HOA theatrics in the past hour than in my entire life." He chuckled lightly and tipped his hat. Sometimes the law has to step in when common sense fails. And with that, he got back into his car and drove off, leaving me and my dogs alone in the quiet, sunlit ranch. I looked around at my property, the barn, the open fields, the gravel driveway, and it all felt perfect. My peace hadn't been stolen, just interrupted briefly by a blonde hurricane of misguided authority. I took a long sip of now cold coffee, savoring the feeling of victory. And then, because some things in life are too good to resist, I started narrating the scene to the empty fields. "You see, my friends," I said, gesturing vaguely at the horizon, "this is why you don't let HOA rules extend into reality. Some people live in their own little world, and sometimes the universe has to step in and remind them whose land it really is." The dogs barked in agreement or perhaps disagreement. Either way, it sounded dramatic enough for me. I spent the rest of the afternoon checking the barn, feeding the animals, and wandering the property, making mental notes about repairs and improvements. But even in the middle of chores, I couldn't stop thinking about the absurdity of what had just happened. Karen had called the sheriff on me, trying to enforce rules that didn't apply. And yet here I was, victorious, still in possession of my land, my driveway, and my dignity. The neighbors, having witnessed the showdown, waved and smiled cautiously from their fences. Some even approached later to offer congratulations. One of them leaned over a fence and whispered, "I've never seen Karen so humbled." I chuckled and replied, "Yeah, it's a rare sight, like a unicorn with a rule book." By evening, the sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow across the fields. The dogs lay lazily at my feet, tired from all the excitement. I finally leaned back, feeling the weight of tension lift from my shoulders. The ranch had returned to its serene self. The birds chirped, the wind rustled through the trees, and the only drama left was the memory of Karen's meltdown. I took another sip of coffee, thinking about how often life surprises you. You plan a quiet weekend, hopping for relaxation and peace, and instead you get a front-row seat to human absurdity, law enforcement, and the satisfying sound of reality smacking someone in the face. And yet I wouldn't trade it for anything. This ranch, my land, and even the chaos that occasionally lands on my driveway are mine. Karen's trespass had been the ultimate reminder: property rights aren't suggestions. They're law, and sometimes law is hilariously vindictive. As I watched the sun set over the fields, I finally allowed myself to relax completely. No phones ringing, no HOA drama, no blonde hurricanes with a sense of entitlement. Just me, the dogs, the ranch, and the satisfaction of having survived and triumphed over pure overzealous absurdity. I chuckled quietly, shaking my head. "Next weekend," I muttered to the empty air, "we just stick to cows and coffee. No drama, no trespassing, no phone-carrying storms of chaos." The dogs barked in agreement or perhaps in warning, but either way it felt like the perfect end. And with that, I finally sipped the last of my coffee, letting the warm liquid and the quiet ranch soothe what remained of my frayed nerves. The showdown was over. Koran had been legally and spectacularly shut down. My property, my peace, and my pride were intact. The ranch was mine, the law was clear, and for the first time that day, everything felt right in the world. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.